In the closing chapters of the oldest book in the Bible, after Job has spent nearly 40 chapters demanding an explanation for his suffering, God does something unexpected. He does not answer Job's questions directly. Instead, he opens a door onto two creatures so strange, so overwhelming, that the entire argument of the book seems to dissolve into wonder. Their names are Behemoth and Leviathan, and for thousands of years, readers have argued over what they actually are, where they came from, and why the creator of the universe chose these two beings, out of everything he could have shown a suffering man, as his final word on the mystery of pain and power. To understand why, we have to step into the world of Job chapter 40 and 41, a world where poetry and theology and something older than both of them meet on the same page. The book of Job begins with a righteous man stripped of everything he has, his wealth, his children, his health, his peace, and for chapter after chapter, Job pleads with heaven for a hearing, certain that if he could only stand before God and present his case, he would be vindicated. His friends offer explanations rooted in a simple formula, that suffering follows sin and blessing follows righteousness. But Job knows this formula does not fit his life, and he says so with increasing boldness, until finally he demands that God answer him directly. And then, out of a whirlwind, God speaks. But what follows is not a legal defense or a philosophical treatise. It is a tour of creation itself, a rapid, breathless sweep through the foundations of the earth, the storehouses of snow and hail, the birthplace of the rain, the wild donkey and the ostrich and the war horse, each one a reminder that the universe was built on wisdom Job does not possess and cannot fully see. And then, as the tour reaches its climax, God slows down. Two creatures receive far more attention than anything else in the entire speech. Behemoth is introduced first, described as a creature God made along with Job himself, a being whose strength is in his loins and whose power is in the muscles of his belly, whose tail moves like a cedar, whose bones are tubes of bronze and limbs like bars of iron. He is called the first of the ways of God, a phrase that has puzzled scholars for centuries, suggesting either that he was the first and greatest of God's creative works, or that he stands as a kind of archetype, first in rank among all the creatures that walk the earth. He lies under the lotus plants, in the covert of the reed and marsh, the willows of the brook surrounding him. The river may rage against him, and he is not troubled. He is confident, even though the Jordan rushes into his mouth. No one can take him by his eyes, or pierce his nose with a snare. He is utterly untamable, and yet he grazes on grass like an ox, a strange and almost domestic detail nestled inside a description of overwhelming power. For centuries, readers have debated what animal, if any, stands behind this description. Some point to the hippopotamus, with its massive frame, its life half submerged in African rivers, its grass-eating diet, and surprising ferocity when provoked. Others see traces of the elephant, with limbs like iron bars and a tail compared to a cedar tree. But many careful readers have noticed that the description resists any single earthly animal. No hippopotamus has a tail like a cedar. No known creature fits every detail. And this has led generations of interpreters toward a different possibility, that Behemoth is not merely a large animal, but something closer to a primordial force given flesh, a creature standing at the very edge between the natural world and the mythic imagination of the ancient Near East. A being that represents raw, untamed land power the way its counterpart represents raw, untamed sea power. Because immediately after Behemoth, the speech turns to something even more extraordinary. Leviathan receives an entire chapter of his own, more space than any other single subject in the whole book of Job, and the tone shifts from description to outright challenge. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? God asks Job. or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak soft words to you? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you put him on a leash for your girls? The questions come in a relentless rhythm, each one designed to expose the absolute gulf between human capability and the raw power of this creature. No warrior dares rouse him. Who then is able to stand before me? God asks, turning the argument from Leviathan back to himself. Because if no man can face this beast, how much less can any man face the one who made him? And then comes the description itself, terrifying and strangely beautiful at once. Leviathan's back is rows of shields, shut up closely as with a seal, one so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together so that they cannot be parted. His sneezes flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go burning torches. Sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goes smoke, as from a boiling pot or burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and flame goes out of his mouth. In his neck remains strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. The flakes of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him. They cannot be moved. His heart is as firm as a stone, as hard as a piece of a lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. They are beside themselves with terror. The sword that reaches him cannot avail, nor spear, nor dart, nor javelin. He counts iron as straw, bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Slingstones become like stubble to him. Darts are counted as stubble. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. On earth there is nothing like him, which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. Fire-breathing scales, impenetrable armor, eyes like the dawn, a heart of stone, dominion over the deep, and finally, that last unforgettable line, king over all the children of pride. Many scholars have connected the physical description to the crocodile of the Nile, a creature the ancient Egyptians themselves regarded with terror and religious awe, armored, unstoppable, capable of dragging a full-grown animal beneath the water in an instant. The scaled back, the powerful jaws, the eyes that seem to gleam above the surface, all point toward something crocodile-like at the foundation of the image. But just as with Behemoth, the poetry pushes beyond biology. No crocodile breathes fire. No crocodile is called king over all the children of pride. The description has moved from zoology into theology, and to understand why, we need to look outside the book of Job entirely, into the wider world of the ancient Near East, where sea monsters and chaos dragons were not merely literary devices, but deeply embedded religious symbols. In the mythology of Israel's neighbors, the sea itself was often personified as a hostile, chaotic power that had to be subdued before an ordered world could exist. In the Babylonian creation epic, the god Marduk battles the sea goddess Tiamat, a monstrous embodiment of primeval chaos, and from her defeated body he fashions the heavens and the earth. In the texts discovered at ancient Ugarit, on the coast of what is now Syria, the storm god Baal fights a multi-headed sea serpent named Lotan, a name linguistically identical to the Hebrew word Leviathan, in a battle that establishes Baal's kingship over the other gods. These were not obscure stories. They were the dominant religious narratives of the ancient world surrounding Israel, deeply familiar to anyone living in that region and that era. And when the Hebrew scriptures speak of Leviathan, they are speaking directly into this world of ideas, but they transform it completely. Where the pagan myths depict a genuine cosmic battle between rival divine powers, where the outcome is uncertain and the chaos monster is a true threat to the gods themselves, the Hebrew scriptures never allow a Leviathan that kind of independent power. He is not a rival god. He is a creature. Psalm 104 says it most plainly, describing the sea as vast and wide, teeming with creatures beyond number, and then adding, almost as an aside, there is that Leviathan whom you have formed to play in it. The very beast that terrified entire civilizations, worshipped in some cultures and feared in others, is here reduced to a plaything in the hands of the God of Israel, splashing in the waves of an ocean that God himself set boundaries around. This is one of the most radical theological statements in the whole of Scripture, quietly stated, almost playful in tone, and utterly devastating to the mythology surrounding it. Yet the Bible does not always speak of Leviathan so gently. Psalm 74, a communal lament crying out to God in a time of national disaster, remembers an older act of divine power, saying, "You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces. You gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness." Here Leviathan appears not playing, but defeated, crushed, his heads broken as trophies of a primordial victory. Language that many scholars connect to the imagery of creation itself. The taming of the waters at the very beginning of the world, when the Spirit of God hovered over the deep and brought order out of formlessness. And Isaiah, writing centuries later, looks forward rather than backward, promising that in that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Here the ancient chaos monster becomes something more, a symbol projected onto the future, a final judgment awaiting not just a literal creature, but every hostile power arrayed against God's people, every empire, every darkness, every twisting, fleeing, coiling force that resists the reign of heaven. This same trajectory continues into the final book of the Christian scriptures, where a great red dragon appears, ancient, many-headed, standing before a woman about to give birth, seeking to devour her child the moment he is born. And this dragon is explicitly identified as that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. The imagery is unmistakably the descendant of Leviathan the sea dragon and the serpent of Eden fused into a single figure, and later a beast rises out of the sea itself, echoing Leviathan's ancient home in the depths, followed by another beast rising out of the earth, echoing Behemoth's dominion over dry land. Sea power and land power, chaos above the waters and chaos beneath the mountains, appear once more, but this time cast as instruments of a much larger and more sinister rebellion, still ultimately bound by the same sovereignty that once played with Leviathan like a bird on a leash. So when God finally answers Job with these two creatures, he is drawing on the deepest well of religious imagination available to Job's world, and he is making a claim no other ancient god ever dared to make about the forces of chaos. He is not merely stronger than Behemoth and Leviathan. He made them. Behemoth is called the first of the ways of God, and Leviathan is described as a creature God formed, playful and dangerous both, entirely within the Creator's authority, without needing to fight for it, without any cosmic battle of uncertain outcome. This is the quiet thunder underneath the whole speech. Job wanted an explanation for his suffering. He wanted God to step into the courtroom of human logic and answer according to human categories of justice and desert. And instead, God takes him to the edge of the world and shows him two beings so far beyond human comprehension, so untamable, so terrifying that Job's entire framework collapses under the weight of what he is seeing. If a man cannot even approach Leviathan, cannot put a hook in his nose or make him a household pet, how could that same man expect to fully grasp the ways of the one who formed Leviathan out of nothing and holds him like a toy in the palm of his hand? Job's response, when it finally comes, is not an answer to a philosophical puzzle. It is silence turned to worship. "I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear," he says, "but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes." He doesn't receive an explanation for his suffering. He receives something else instead, a vision of a God so vast that human suffering, while never trivial, is folded into a wisdom too large for any single human life to measure. And this is why interpreters across the centuries have returned again and again to Behemoth and Leviathan, finding in them a mirror for whatever chaos threatens to overwhelm a given generation. The early church fathers often read the beasts allegorically, seeing in Behemoth an image of gluttony or earthly pride, and in Leviathan an image of the devil himself, the great sea serpent whose scales no weapon could pierce, defeated finally only by the hook of the incarnation, a metaphor several ancient writers used with striking boldness, imagining Christ's humanity as bait lowered into the deep to snare the ancient enemy who could not resist the trap laid within human flesh. Medieval theologians developed elaborate bestiaries in which Behemoth and Leviathan stood as emblems of the two great temptations facing the soul: brute earthly appetite on one hand and cunning spiritual pride on the other, the ox that eats grass and the serpent that speaks in riddles, together forming a complete portrait of how sin operates both in the body and in the mind. Centuries later, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes borrowed the name Leviathan for his famous work of political theory, using the image of an unstoppable, awe-inspiring power to describe the kind of state authority he believed necessary to prevent society from collapsing into the same chaos the ancient sea monster once represented. A striking example of how deeply this image has embedded itself into the wider imagination of the Western world, far beyond the borders of religious literature. And in more recent generations, students of prophecy have looked at Leviathan and Behemoth and wondered whether these ancient beasts point toward realities not yet fully unveiled. Whether the untamable power described in Job whispers of forces still active beneath the surface of history, still coiled in the deep places of the world, waiting for the day when every chaos, ancient and future alike, will finally be brought under full and visible submission. What remains constant through every century of interpretation is the core theological weight of the original passage. These are not simply monster stories meant to frighten or entertain. They are meant to relocate the human soul in relation to its creator. In a world that often feels chaotic, unjust, and beyond understanding, the book of Job does not offer easy answers. It offers instead an encounter, a direct, overwhelming vision of a God whose power extends over every terrifying thing that swims in the deep or roams the reeds along the riverbank, a God who does not need to explain himself to be worthy of trust, because the same hands that formed Leviathan's armored scales and Behemoth's iron bones are the hands that hold every human life, including the smallest and most broken among them. There is a strange comfort hidden inside the very terror of these chapters. If the fire-breathing king of the deep and the unshakable giant of the marsh are nothing more than creatures fashioned and governed by God's wisdom, then whatever chaos presses in on a suffering human heart, whatever twisting, coiling fear rises up in the night, is likewise held within a sovereignty too vast to be threatened by it. Job never receives the courtroom hearing he demanded. He receives something greater, a glimpse into the architecture of a universe where even the most fearsome things that exist are, in the end, accounted for, named, described in loving and terrible detail, and held firmly within the palm of the one who spoke them into being out of the formless waters at the dawn of time. and who alone remains then and now, worthy of the trust that even the deepest darkness cannot shake. It is worth pausing to notice exactly where in the story this revelation arrives, because the placement itself carries meaning. God does not open the whirlwind speech with Behemoth and Leviathan. He begins with the foundations of the earth, the springs of the sea, the gates of death, the dwelling place of light, and the storehouses of the snow, moving through an entire catalog of creation before slowing at last on the wild donkey who laughs at the city and scorns the shouting of a driver, the ostrich who deals harshly with her young because God has deprived her of wisdom, and the war horse who paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength, who mocks at fear and is not dismayed at the sword. Only after this long procession of untamed and half-wild creatures does the speech arrive at its two final subjects, as though everything before them were preparation, a widening of Job's vision, one creature at a time, until he is ready to look directly at the two beings no human hand has ever mastered. This structure matters because it shows that Behemoth and Leviathan are not an isolated curiosity inserted at random into the poem. They are the summit of a deliberate ascent, the final and most extreme examples in a long argument about the limits of human control over a world that was never handed over to human management in the first place. Job had assumed, like most people in every generation, that the world operates on a moral ledger he could read and understand, that suffering and blessing follow a legible pattern he was entitled to interpret. The whirlwind speech dismantles that assumption piece by piece, showing him a wild donkey who cannot be yoked, a war horse who thunders into battle for the sheer glory of it, and finally, two creatures who exist entirely outside the boundaries of human dominion, immune to every hook, every snare, every weapon a man might bring against them. The ancient Hebrew word for behemoth is itself unusual, an intensified plural form of the ordinary word for beast or cattle, which many grammarians read as a superlative construction, something like the beast of all beasts, the ultimate animal, an intensity built directly into the grammar of the name. Leviathan's name likewise carries an old and loaded history, appearing not only in Job, but also in a handful of other biblical passages that each add another layer to the picture. Beyond the verses already considered, the prophet Amos speaks of a serpent that bites those who think they can flee from divine judgment, an image scholars have long connected to the same family of sea serpent imagery running throughout Hebrew poetry. The broader ancient world surrounding Israel imagined the sea as the domain most resistant to order, the one part of creation that seemed to refuse every human attempt at settlement, travel, or control, a churning and unpredictable expanse where sailors vanished and storms rose without warning. Against that backdrop, the biblical claim that God assigned the sea its boundary, telling it, "This far you may come and no farther, and here your proud waves must stop," becomes an extraordinary declaration of sovereignty. And Leviathan, as the personification of everything wild and untamable about that same sea, becomes the fitting symbol of just how total that sovereignty really is. It is significant that in the Genesis account of creation, when God forms the great sea creatures on the fifth day, the text uses the Hebrew word tananium, often translated sea monsters or great creatures, the same word family used elsewhere for the very serpents and dragons that populate the mythologies of Israel's neighbors. Genesis does not deny that such creatures exist. It simply places them calmly within a single day's work of an orderly six-day creation, listed alongside birds and fish with no drama attached, no battle required, no rival power to overcome, a deliberate and almost understated way of declaring that whatever loomed as a terrifying cosmic threat in the religious imagination of the ancient world was, to the God of Israel, simply another creature he spoke into existence and pronounced good. This pattern of quiet, confident sovereignty runs through every biblical reference to Leviathan and Behemoth. and it stands in sharp contrast to the anxious, embattled tone of the surrounding mythologies, where the gods themselves feared the chaos monster and had to fight desperately to survive its challenge. There is no fear in the biblical God's voice as he describes Leviathan's fire and armor and unbreakable strength. There is, if anything, something like delight, the delight of a craftsman describing his finest and most intricate work, lingering over every detail the way an artist lingers over the parts of a masterpiece other people might overlook. This delight is easy to miss beneath the terror of the description, but it is there in the specificity of it all, the exact count of the shield-like scales, the precise description of how his sneezes flash light and his breath kindles coals, details far beyond anything necessary simply to frighten Job into submission. A God who wanted only to overwhelm Job with fear could have listed Leviathan's power in a single verse. Instead, the poem lingers for an entire chapter, savoring the creature the way Job might have once savored a well-told story. And this lingering suggests that part of what God wants Job to see is not only his own smallness, but also the sheer, overflowing abundance of divine creativity. A universe far richer and stranger and more wonderful than the narrow moral calculus Job had been demanding an explanation within. For a viewer today, living in a world just as capable of feeling chaotic and unjust as Job's world once did, wars breaking out with no warning, sickness striking without explanation, disasters that seem to answer to no discernible pattern of merit or fault. The ancient image of Leviathan and Behemoth still carries the same message it carried thousands of years ago on the ash heap where Job sat scraping his sores. The forces that feel unstoppable to human eyes, the powers that seem to answer to no one, the chaos that appears to swallow whole nations and whole lives without regard for fairness, are not, in the biblical vision, ultimate. They are creatures. They were made. They have a name, a description, a place in creation, and a maker who holds them the way a shepherd holds a wild animal on a leash, dangerous to every hand but his own, and even then, not truly dangerous, because the leash never slips, and the boundary the sea was given at the beginning of time has never once been crossed without divine permission. This is perhaps the deepest and most enduring reason believers across every generation, since Job, have returned to these two strange and terrifying chapters, not to solve a zoological puzzle about hippopotamuses and crocodiles, and not merely to trace the echoes of ancient Near Eastern mythology through the poetry of Scripture, but to stand again at the edge of the whirlwind and remember that the God who answers out of the storm is not a God who needs to justify himself to the chaos of the world, because the chaos itself, however fierce, however armored, however wreathed in fire and smoke, was always and only ever his to begin with, called into being at his word, sustained by his breath, and destined, in the fullness of time, to bow before the same voice that once asked a grieving man on an ash heap a single, unanswerable question: "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?"